Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill coming to you from my vegetable garden on yet another very hot day. We live in Zone 5 in eastern Washington State, and we get very cold winters and quite a lot of snow. But even so, I am able to garden here year-round and without supplemental heat. So today's topic is growing salad greens through the fall and winter months, and I'm going to show you how I do it. Several years ago, I was curious to see if I could grow some vegetables during the winter months if I provided them with a little extra protection from the cold. So I started out very simply. All I did was I put some hoops over one of my raised beds. I chose some cool season crops. I covered the bed with some floating row cover when we started getting frost in the fall, and then when the temperatures dropped, I added a sheet of clear plastic. While I did have some success, the plants mostly struggled. And so I've really learned a lot over the years. And that's what I wanted to share with you, is some tips to be successful at doing this.
This is what my first winter garden looked like. And here are some of the veggies I grew that made it through the winter. Not too bad.
Now before I get ahead of myself, I wanted to make sure you understood what floating row cover is. And this is some right here. It is a fabric that's very lightweight. It lets in sunlight and moisture. And I can use it as a season extender in the early spring and late in the year. It provides a few degrees of frost protection, which is very helpful. But the other instance that I use it for, and that's an example right here, is to cover plants that are very susceptible to certain types of damaging insects, and the crops don't need to be pollinated. So in this bed I have Swiss chard and beets. They are very susceptible to leaf miners, which are so damaging. And so these plants do not need to be pollinated. I keep them covered for the whole season. But in this case, what I'm really talking about is the few degrees of frost protection that the floating row cover provides. Now let's talk about the tips for being successful at growing veggies through the fall and winter months. Number one is pick the sunniest spot you can, because light is crucial. Those plants definitely need as much light as they can get. And of course, think about the winter months when the sun is lower in the sky. So if you plant your winter garden next to a hedge, big trees, next to a building, they will probably not get very much sunlight and they won't do very well. So pick a nice sunny spot.
Choose really cold tolerant varieties of vegetables. The crops I've had the best luck with are miner's lettuce, which also is known as Claytonia, corn salad, which is also known as Mache, the curly types of kale that are very hardy, such as Vates and Winterbore, and Matador spinach, which I grew for the first time last winter, and the cold temperatures didn't even faze it. I also planted a couple of types of lettuce, which you wouldn't think would be hardy enough, but they did really well. Another really tough salad green is Minutina. Here's what it looks like. All of these greens are very tasty, and it's always a good idea to try new things, right? And here's what Claytonia or miner's lettuce looks like, corn salad or Mache, and Vates kale.
When you make some hoops for your winter bed, make sure you choose a material that is nice and strong, because if you get snow, you need something that will hold up under that snow load. Now the first year that I grew veggies during the winter months, I used our regular hoops, which is what we use to hold up floating row cover or netting over some of the plants. They don't need to be very strong. Well, this is not strong enough for a snow load, and of course they would collapse over the beds, and that's no good. So I would recommend either a 1-inch diameter plastic sprinkler pipe or electrical conduit that you have bent to fit over your beds. Start your seeds nice and early. I would recommend either the end of July or early August. And I know that sounds so early, but the reason is that you want the plants to develop a good root system before the weather gets really cold. That way they will tolerate the cold better and they'll be more productive, which is certainly the goal for all of us, right? For starting your seeds, I would recommend starting things like kale, spinach, lettuce, and or Minutina indoors, and you would transplant them out to your winter garden once they have a few true leaves, which are the mature leaves. For things like corn salad and Claytonia or miner's lettuce, you will want to direct sow them into your bed, and that's because they do not like to have their roots disturbed, so just plant them in place. Now there's one thing that I've learned the hard way, and I wanted to share it with you so that you can avoid having the same problem. And that is that when you plant your winter garden, it's pretty late in the growing season, but there are still certain types of damaging insects that are out and about. And so you need to protect susceptible plants from them. So for example, I love to grow kale every winter. And kale is a member of the cabbage family. So cabbage butterflies are still out and about late in the season, laying eggs on the leaves, and then you end up with those disgusting cabbage worms. So what I like to do is to protect the kale plants with either floating row cover, or what you're looking at here is that bridal veil netting or tulle, T-U-L-L-E, and that will keep those nasty cabbage butterflies away from the plant leaves. The other example is spinach. I love growing spinach. In that first year that I grew it during the winter, I found out that leaf miners are active much later than I thought they would be. So when I plant my spinach out in my garden, I definitely cover it with floating row cover to keep those adult leaf miners from the leaves where they want to lay the eggs, and then you end up with those little worms. Yuck! I've occasionally had to deal with slugs during the winter months. Now you would think that they're so tender and delicate that there's no way they would make it through the winter. And yes, they do, so no such luck. However, I have two methods I've used successfully for keeping the slugs away, and I wanted to share them with you. The first method involves copper tape. You can easily find small rolls of it at a garden center. And what you do is you make individual circles of it, and you put one at the base of each kale seedling. And this is really intriguing. So apparently what happens is the skin of the slugs reacts electrically, in a negative way, to the copper in the copper tape. And so they want nothing to do with that. So it has worked really well in keeping the slugs away. The other thing I do is I make what's called a beer trap, and all you do is you take either a cat food can that's empty or an empty tuna can, and you sink it into the soil where the lip of the can is even with the surface of the soil. And then you put about an inch of beer in there. Just use cheap beer, don't use those fancy microbrews. And what happens is the slugs are very attracted to the smell of yeast. They come to investigate, they fall in, and they drown. Yes! So the funny thing that I heard once is that you don't want to fill your can to the rim with beer, because then all you've created is a slug pub. We don't want them taking a sip, enjoying the beer, and going off, right? So keep in mind and keep a lookout for the fact that slugs could be in your garden. If you get a snowstorm, be sure to knock the snow off of your bed as quickly as possible, because remember, those plants need that sunlight. I'm sure you've noticed this hoop house in the background, and I wanted to explain a little bit more about it. So my husband and I built it 4 years ago, primarily as a way for me to grow a winter garden more successfully. But we also use it during the summer months to grow warm season crops. This year, that's peppers. And it works really great, so we do get to use it year round. Now it's very lightweight and portable, so we can move it to different areas of the garden as we rotate our crops. But I also want to point out that you do not need to have something as fancy as a hoop house in order to grow a winter garden. You just need some hoops, a sheet of clear plastic, and some floating row cover, and you're good to go. But if you're interested in the specs on this hoop house, just go to my website, susansinthegarden.com, and use the search window to search for Hoop House Project. You'll even find a video showing how we put it all together.
Here's what our hoop house looked like after a winter storm, but it really does great, and we sure enjoy growing all kinds of veggies in it. If you're looking for a couple of good reference books on this topic, I heartily recommend Elliot Coleman's Winter Harvest Handbook from Chelsea Green Publishing and Nikki Jabour's Year-Round Vegetable Gardener from Story Publishing. Elliot lives in Maine and Nikki lives in Nova Scotia, so they both know what it's like to deal with very cold winters, yet still grow lots of produce.
So what do you think? Do you want to give this a try? I hope so, because I always think it's fun to learn new things. Now, if you have any questions at all or any problems that come up, please don't hesitate to contact me. My email address is susan@susansinthegarden.com. I'll see you next week.